Hello, my name's Jill Marsh. I'm a Methodist minister and I'm currently working in the Northampton Methodist District as their mission enabler. I'm doing this webinar because over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been doing some research for a professional doctorate in practical theology, and it's been about ethnic diversity within the British Methodist Church. Yesterday, I held a seminar called Cosmopolitan Church Life, and I'm actually going to be sharing with you the slides from that, as some people have asked for them. I did my doctorate at the University of Chester. There won't be opportunity to talk today because actually this is me recording in my own time. But if you'd like to be in touch, I'll leave you my email address at the end for you to be able to contact me. I want to begin with a moment's quiet and these words from the Methodist worship book of more than 20 years ago. Blessed are you, Holy God, for people of every language and culture, and for the rich variety that you give to life. Amen. So I want to begin by thinking a little bit about cosmopolitanism and what it might mean. The bit I'm going to read you in a minute is an excerpt from my research journal. I live in Leicester and somebody lent me a flat to do some writing in for my thesis write-up. And I wrote this. On my 15-minute walk from the city centre shops to the flat, I've spoken with a Polish woman and her young daughter who wanted to show me her very pink new doll. I've also passed a group of Somalian lads talking about the recent increase in stabbings in London. They were pretending to stab each other, and then when they spotted me waiting to pass, they parted the way with an apology for holding me up. As I approached the flats, a Nigerian friend spotted me on his bike and stopped to say hello. Lastly, in the lift, a student with a Spanish accent commented on what I was carrying and asked whether the enormous halal supermarket opposite sells any European dinners. I use that quotation because it seems to me it's a good description of what for many people now is a cosmopolitan reality. It has come to mean, as a word, the world in one place. It began from the Greek meaning citizen of the world. At one stage, as in the Cosmopolitan magazine, it was seen as a really expensive option for people who love to travel, people who would set off often around Europe, but around the further world as well, who would not really engage with local people, but would collect things that they loved and bring them back to put them in their house to show how rich they were, that they could travel in this way. I guess that's why, or one of the many reasons why there's been historical tension between cosmopolitanism and religion. Religion is seen as being rooted and incarnational, cosmopolitanism as being floating around the world and not particularly fitting in anywhere. And there has been that historical tension. So I began to wonder, what does it mean for those of us who have cosmopolitan experience to put that together with the faith that we have? In the world of geography, the phrase the everyday cosmopolitanism of today's UK society has become a common phrase. Some geographers, Suzanne Wessendorf, for example, call it corner shop cosmopolitanism. In other words, in the amount of time it takes to go to the corner shop to get a pint of milk, you could have the experiences such as I've just described. Here in the UK, I guess most of us will have had church experience or know of church experience where the congregations have changed and become ethnically diverse because of the changing population around them. As Methodists, we sent missionaries out around the world, and then people from those countries have become Methodists. And as they have come to the UK for a whole range of different reasons, one of the first things they will do is to look out a Methodist church. And so whether congregations have wanted to change or not, they have. And that's the experience that I am describing as chapel cosmopolitanism. And in this thesis, I'm using chapel cosmopolitanism as a description of the willingness of others within the life of a congregation to engage with the diversity that this experience brings. In the thesis, I used the definition from Novica and Ravisco, who say that cosmopolitanism is a practice which is apparent in things that people do and say to positively engage with the otherness of the other. I like that definition, although it comes from a secular background, partly because one of the key commandments for Christians is to love your neighbour as yourself. And when we love our neighbours as ourselves in settings of chapel cosmopolitanism where people are very different from one another, I believe this can lead to a cosmopolitan practical theology. In other words, a practical living out of our theology in which we have a practice of being positively engaged with the otherness of the other. And that comes from a theological idea, particularly our basis on Veiling, a practical theologian, who said that God is other than us. And then these are my words, but he talks about how if God is other than us, then to engage with the otherness of the other is to engage with the godness in the goodness of others. And that's an idea that I began my research with, a belief that God is other than us, and that if we engage with the otherness of the other, then we engage with godness in the goodness of others. The flip side of that, of course, is that if we refuse to engage with others positively, we refuse to engage with God. And that is why I think this is so important. So just a little bit about who I am and what perspective I'm coming from. I live in Leicester, as I mentioned, or Leicestershire now. I've always been in England. As a small child, I wanted to be a missionary abroad in other places. But as I grew older, I felt a calling to be a missionary here in this country. And I've been a teacher. I've always lived in England, as I said, and I recently discovered that all of my ancestors, as far back as I can go, came from the East Midlands area. My granddads were both miners in Nottinghamshire. Having said that, the whole of my adult life has been in intercultural settings, and in fact, when my two children began school, they were each of them, the only white child in the class as they began school. So that just is an example of one of the ways in which just being here in England, we can live a very intercultural life. My research interest began because when I arrived in Leicester, I was given two churches which I was told were multicultural. One of those churches had people from the Caribbean, from the Windrush generation and onwards, one family with 4 generations in the same church, and also white British people who loved the same kind of 1950s culture, which was still existent when the Caribbean generation arrived. And so, for different reasons, that church kept that culture as it was. And people arrived from other countries, African countries that had Methodist heritage, but they never seemed to stay in that church. Meanwhile, I had another church that was also described as multicultural. It actually had a majority of white people and just a handful of people from other places when I arrived. But it increasingly became more diverse. It grew and it grew in diversity. And so I began to wonder why one of these churches was changing and the other one wasn't. The context for my research is that I began it at the end of a 3-year project called Belonging Together, which the Methodist Church ran, looking into ethnic diversity within the British Methodist Church, racial justice, equality, diversity and inclusion. And at the end of the project 2013, it concluded, amongst other things, what Belonging Together has demonstrated is that ethnic inclusion cannot be left to chance or choice, nor indeed be reduced to quotas or compliance. This agenda will need to be owned and championed at all levels of church governance and leadership, and of fellowship and meaningful interaction across the connection. The core questions that remain are, how can the Methodist Church do this meaningfully and intentionally? And what would meaningful, intentional inclusion look like? I hope that my thesis, my research findings will contribute to this conversation. My research moved through different questions during the time that I did the research, and sometimes those 3 questions came together. I began by asking myself, if we do all belong together, or we should all belong together, then what hinders and what helps people as they attempt to live this out? The second question, which became very important to my thesis, was about what it means to be white. I am a white person, I am a white researcher, I am a white minister. What difference does it make for me to be white amongst people from different backgrounds? And then thirdly, the question I had was, what does it mean to love your neighbour as yourself within an ethnically diverse congregation? When I led the webinar yesterday, we went into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. And if you're watching this with others, you might want to just pause and think about which of these questions most interests you, or why have you come along to think about this together today? And you could pause at this point. So I want to tell you a little bit briefly about how I did the study. It was what's called an ethnographic observer participant study. I belonged to a church for 18 months. It was a lovely church to belong to, and I felt supported and prayed for in that place, even though they knew I was a researcher and they knew what I was doing there. It was a large town centre Methodist church. It had been ethnically diverse since the Windrush generation, with groups of more recently arrived members from a variety of countries. As I went through the time there, the challenge to me was older white people preferring not to be interviewed, and yet talking with me increasingly freely about their experience of ethnically diverse church life. And as a white person, I found that it was interesting just to see how white people were affecting the church life that they belonged to. And although I couldn't interview them because they didn't want to be interviewed, in the end, I was able to give them voice and to speak about what they had shared with me. I called them Norman because we often make it the norm to think of white experience. Older white people's experience is often the norm in Methodist churches. And Violet, Violet was not a shrinking Violet, but she did have a blue rinse. And so Norman and Violet, who are imaginary characters, became the spokespeople and the focus for my study and for my learning. At one point, one of my participants asked me, or said to me, accused me really, "You're making it all very black and white." So I wanted to say at the beginning of this conversation about why I have within this research continued to use black and white to describe people. I am, after all, not really white in skin colour. The black friends I have are not really black in skin colour. And yet we do talk about black people. And black people are often very aware in a white majority country or a white majority church of being black. Anthony Reddy and others have done research which shows that white people very rarely think of themselves in a white majority country as white. So I started to think about the fact that we have black theology. I hope that lots of us have read some black theology to hear about what it means to gain insights about God from the experience of being black. And I certainly have gained a lot from black theology over the decades of my ministry. But it occurred to me that actually I never really think about what white theology might be, or what I might as a white person, how my whiteness might impact on my own theology. It's almost as though what we're saying is that black theology is specific because it is non-white. And yet we never ask ourselves really what whiteness might be. And actually very, very much of the theology we share and have shared through the centuries in the UK particularly has been white, even though we don't normally think of it in that way. So I continue to use black and white to describe people, really to describe which side of the privilege they are on. And we will talk a bit more about that as I go through. But white people are undoubtedly privileged. So what does it mean to be white? In 2006, this book, Frost and Jordan, quoted Sybil Phoenix, a well-known local preacher, a Methodist local preacher who was very, very active in racial justice awareness training. She said, "There is only one race, the human race." Willie Jennings, who's written lots of really helpful things about what it means, what whiteness means, and when people began to think of being white, he says nobody is born white. We may be born with this skin colour, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are born white. Perkinson says, most simply put, whiteness is a power of opposition. And both Jennings and Perkinson talk about how whiteness began, or the idea, the concept of being white people or other black but being black people or people from different, whatever the description is, that whiteness and the whole grading of people's skin colour began with the colonial European expansion. When white people first encountered people who were different from them, had to work out how to deal with this, began to label and to categorise people, and to decide that it was all right for some people to be sold into slavery and for others to own other people. So whiteness actually began at that point, and beginning to think about people in different ways. Starr said in 2001, if church groups were able to think through the notion of white privilege, it would be more difficult for white Christians to deny the part they play in maintaining a racist society. And this is certainly something I agree with through the research that I've been doing. So my research questions became, is a cosmopolitan practical theology possible when we've got this privileging of whiteness? Is it possible to love our neighbours as ourselves by engaging with the otherness of the other? And if that is possible, what might it look like? And I'm just going to pause for a moment while I put my light on. Welcome back. I'm just going to go back to my screen sharing now. So my research questions, as I said, became, is a cosmopolitan practical theology possible? And what might that look like? Sorry for the little hiccup with the technology there. I hope this will work this time. Got to find the slide that I was on. And I believe it looked like this. So I've described what my research questions were, and is a cosmopolitan practical theology possible? I began the research with some ideas about what that might look like. And the first thing was that I believe there needs to be a decision to celebrate diversity as God-given. This might be an initial decision as a church gets going, or it might gradually evolve as the church begins to encounter ethnic diversity. There needs to be confidence for people about their own cultural identity in the light of and growing from experience of intercultural congregational life. One lovely lady who only spoke to me once said to me one day that she'd been on holiday in Italy, and she said, I always learn more about myself when I encounter people who are different. And then we began to think about what that might mean in her own church's life. There also needs to be a willingness of the church's leadership, and I think that has to be more than the minister. It needs to be a combination of leadership people. But there needs to be a willingness to face and address the spatial, cultural, and theological differences which threaten to keep separate or to divide congregational members or groupings. There also needs to be a commitment to speak honestly through misunderstanding stories and to create opportunities for exploration of mutual understanding. Megara Sharp's written a fantastic book called Misunderstanding Stories, and she describes how whenever there is intercultural life, there will be misunderstandings and sometimes fallouts or arguments. But these are always opportunities to create a deeper understanding as those stories are explored together rather than ignored. And then fifthly, I had at the beginning the idea that care across potential cultural barriers, which is honest about each other's needs, yet outweighs concern for our own preferences. Which is interesting how some of my white participants said to me that they didn't want to end up in the minority. And yet the black people were currently in the minority, and yet they claimed to love their neighbours as themselves. So the thing that they didn't want for themselves, they didn't really recognise was also true for people already. Anyway, those were the 5 things that I began with. And I then worked with three concepts, but from two scholars. I relied quite heavily on Anthony Reddy and on all sorts of other scholars as I did my research. But these particular concepts were the ones I worked with as I tried to understand the data that I found in my research. Gerardo Marti writes about havens and the need for people to find havens within which they feel comfortable in being themselves. Michael Jagassar talks about intercultural habit, and he means that in the sense of Pierre Bourdieu. So not about things that people do necessarily, but a way of life, an approach to life. And he talks about the need for Christians to have an intercultural habit. And he divides that into two things. He talks about moral imagination, which he sees as a passion for the possibility of becoming intercultural, and also seeking to move beyond dialogue and inclusion to justice in the making. He also talks, as part of his explanation of intercultural habit, about mutual inconveniencing. In other words, the need for people to practice putting themselves out for one another in order to encourage transformation through internal and mutual critique of our motives. Why is it that we want to do things the way we want to do them? Why might somebody else, thinking of the moral imagination, want to do something differently? And how can we put ourselves out for one another in order for things to be fair? So I worked with these concepts, and just as an example of havens, I love this quotation from an American Korean Christian. Something different happened to my parents on Sundays. I saw the tension melt from their faces as they settled into the pews and chairs. I saw the comfort and familiarity in which they carried conversations like a burden being lifted from their shoulders. I saw the way they laughed easily and happily talked and shared with other church members. My parents and I immigrated from South Korea when I was just a baby, so this church was a slice of home for them. And in my research time with my study church, I watched the way in which people created havens in which they could relax and be themselves and speak the way they chose to speak and laugh with friends and feel at home. Then I began to look for the moral imagination, which Michael Jagassar talks about. And an interesting example of this was a white woman called Pauline, who was a friend with a black woman called Marilyn. Pauline was shocked to hear that some of Marilyn's friends think she is a traitor to mix with white people at the church. It had never occurred to her that Marilyn might know anybody who would think that they shouldn't be friendly with each other. The level of openness as they talked was clear, and their willingness to learn from one another was also apparent, building on a longer friendship. This was a good example of a friendship through which Pauline learned more about Marilyn, and Marilyn was able to share more of who she was with Pauline, who from then on had a greater sense of what was and wasn't life like for Marilyn and what was and wasn't fair. When it came to mutual inconveniencing that Michael Jagassar talks about, it was very difficult to see much of this at all in my study church. There was some, but this was a quite typical comment from Violet when I first met her. I told her what I was doing, and she said, well, we do have lots of people from other countries here, but it doesn't make any difference to me. A pretty clear example of somebody who wasn't willing to let it make any difference to her. And then one of my older participants, who was in his 80s, Jack, and who often spoke about what other people's views were, normally quite confident, but in this bit he was really quite hesitant. One thing which I think bothers some members is that if we're not careful, we're going to lose control of our church. I don't think we will, but it's we oldies, I suppose. We know we're dropping off the shelf. We know it's got to change, and we've got to face that. And I think God will show it as to change. So we don't need to worry about it as long as we listen. That's what I think about it. But there is a worry. People were actually quite reluctant to have things change from how they were. When I began to look at all the data I'd collected and to think about it, a very important thing struck me, which was this. When it comes to havens, we all need havens within an ethnically diverse church. Jill, who's a white member, had been attending for decades, but had not chosen to talk with me until the last service. She asked me what I'd discovered in my time there, and when I outlined this idea of the need for havens, she answered, "Well, I don't feel like I need a haven because for me the church service is enough. It feels like that is exactly what it is. It's an oasis of calm, and I just feel at home." That little snippet was an example of the ways in which I realised that white people, as well as any other kind of person, actually needed a haven. And many of them, without recognising that it was their own need, really fought hard to keep the church as it was, because for them it was a haven from the world around them. So I basically came to believe this, that we all need havens, yet we are unaware of our own ethnicity as white people often. And white people often assume, which is again a trait of whiteness to assume things, that it is only other people who need havens because the church is ours. This unawareness of our own culture prevents the moral imagination and the mutual inconveniencing which are needed for justice. That's one of the main conclusions that I came to. It was interesting how many of my white participants were really kind about people and were really understanding that people who had English as a second or third language might want to get together with people who had their first language. But they always assumed that it was others that had these needs and that they didn't have those needs, rather than realizing that actually when they got together with their older friends and remembered the old days and were able to chat as they chatted as children or as young people and to reminisce, that was for them a haven. So is a cosmopolitan practical theology possible? I think I want to argue that not while white people remain unaware of our whiteness and unwilling to put our own needs firmly alongside the needs of Black brothers and sisters. Not until white people become willing to give up our own privileges and the power that we have for the sake of justice and in order to love our neighbours as ourselves. As a result of that, I went through the things that I thought a cosmopolitan practical theology needed, and you'll recognise the 5 that were there at the beginning of what I said in this section. And I added on to that by the end a 6th one, which is that I believe for cosmopolitan practical theology to actually happen, we would need a recognition by white people of white privilege and a determination to relinquish that privilege. This has been quite a quick run through 6 or 7 years of research. If you would like to read the thesis, and I've written it as interestingly as I can, and if I send it to you electronically, you can decide which bits you want to print and read or which bits you want to leave out. I'd be very happy to send it to you. Or if you want to ask me a question or to make a comment, you'll find my email at the bottom of the slide here. Also, just to let you know that we have a district study day on Saturday, the 24th of October. It is from 10 till 1, but there will be 2 screen breaks. And the title of this day is Can White People Be Saved? Thank you very much for looking and listening, and I hope beginning to engage with some of what I've said. And if you would like any further conversation, please do be in touch. All that remains is just for me to say thank you for your time, and whether you get in touch with me or not, I really hope that this will be the beginning or the continuing of an engagement, which I hope will be lifelong for us all in this really, really important issue if we want the church to be richer and fuller than it already is. Thank you.